All right, let's get things going. Hello and welcome, everyone. Hope everyone has had a great day so far, and we're hoping this session will make it even better. Today's webinar is the third in Amplifi's ESG Data Revolution webinar series, and we'll be covering ESG integrity, elevated by data governance and data quality. We're happy to be hosting this webinar with our partner Precisely and to continue to bring the conversations around ESG to the surface and here in North America. So now for a little bit of housekeeping before we get things kicked off. As with all Amplify webinars, we'll be recording this session. After a little post-production flair, you know how us marketing people do, we'll send you a follow-up email with access to that recording in its full capacity. If you have a question, we're happy to take them. We'll be taking on questions at the end of the session. So to submit your questions, we ask that you utilize the Q&A button at the bottom of your window. If there are questions that we aren't able to get to in the time frame that we have, we will include them and the answers in the follow-up emails to come. So don't worry, your question will not be left out. Now, let's take a moment and get to know our panelists for the day. I'm Tracy Zatinik, the marketing manager for Amplify covering North America. Joining me is Eric Gilbo. He is the Precisely Interworks practice director at Amplify. And Mike Ortman is joining us from Precisely, and he is a senior sales engineer. Both have vast amounts of experience with data management, governance, and quality in a multitude of different verticals. All right, so let's get the show on the road. Can one of you gentlemen help us level set with an understanding of ESG before we dive deeper?
I think I can probably get us started on that. So really, before we talk about ESG specifically, it's important to kind of think and put this into perspective as far as timeframes, because really it's nothing new. It's just a change and a shift in how we approach consumers, right? With the information that's provided. Environmental concerns have been around forever. It's been around since, the 70s. I think 1970 was the first Earth Day. So after that, agencies like EPA started coming into existence, and we started to realize that these things were important. And that happens with a change in generation, right? And as those generations get older, those generations have more buying power. So then it translates to consumer spending. And that's kind of a key thing to keep in mind with this. So what we're seeing is the shift today is that now there's even more data available, and there's another change in behavior. And the millennials are getting to the point where they have the buying power. Millennials were very interested in the things that were happening when they were kids, right? We were just talking about this beforehand. As we grew up, we watched Saturday morning cartoons, we saw things, we said the internet was introduced and all of these new things became available, right? So there became a shift in attitude and the way that we approach purchasing decisions and the way that we think, right? It's based on what we grew up with. And if you think about, you correlate that to Earth Day, right? Earth Day 1970 was more of a general. Earth Day 1990, you start getting into the 90s, it was all about recycling. Recycling was really important. So then you saw a shift in packaging and in everything else to everything went to recycled bottles, and all these things started happening naturally. That's what we wanted to do as companies because we need to shift. And there's data associated with that becomes a part of that. So it becomes a very important piece. You go forward another 10 years, and now we start talking about greenhouse gas emissions and things like that that became important socially around me at that time. So that also ties to the S here, the social piece to some extent, but it's really tied back to environmental concerns. So what we really want to do when we talk about the E in ESG and environment is look at environmental concerns as a whole. So it's not just what agency is governing and what's going on there. The governance piece comes naturally, and that tends to come first, right? Because the EPA started. So that was the governance agency, and the data that supports it gets tied to that. So those things are really important to think of. But what starts to happen is it's really a mentality and it's an approach to your data that you're going to be able to hit these key points that are important now to the consumer. So as we get to the millennial generation, they spend a lot of time reading reviews. They spend a lot of time looking at the details and the specifications and the important pieces of information. And you can see it when you go to the grocery store. If you go now, there are 25 different labels on every piece of dairy that you see. And it takes me forever to read everything if I want to do it, unless I ask my wife, and she's already done the research. So she said, hey, go pick up that brand because that brand does these three things and it's important to me. And I say, okay, great. So those are the key points that we have to have. And that's where this shift in the environment piece has happened, is that we've kind of gone from just brand loyalty initially. If you go all the way back to the boomers, it was, I buy this brand and this is where I'm at, to a shift to more environmentally conscious elements at a high level and governance, right? Saying, is it safe? Those are the things that were kind of the first piece. And now we're at a point where, as a company, do I support their practices? Do I think that they're doing what they need to sustain me and to sustain my kids and my kids' kids? And again, that comes from the social background from the time period that we all grew up in, right? Within the generations. So this all ties to the social piece, which is the next piece of it. Again, lots of data available within the social world. But with social, we're talking more about kind of some of the small pieces. Like a good example, if you look at inclusion and you look at diversity within the workplace, those things weren't as important 2 generations ago, 3 generations ago, but they became more important because what was happening around us, right, within the news and with everything that we grew up with, and we were hit with it consistently. And the fact that you had the explosion of the internet and everything else, we now have these global sources that we could pull from. So now it wasn't just me asking my neighbors, asking, maybe calling somebody up on the phone, maybe even calling them internationally. It was, I have everything in my fingertips and I can get all of this information all at once and I can start making those decisions. So now, naturally, based on what was happening within our country and around the world, people become more socially conscious. And those pieces of data become much more important. And you can use them to kind of share out what you do. And I've got some examples I'll show here in a little bit. I kind of want to turn it over to Mike, though, so he can start talking about the governance piece. And then we'll circle back on some specific examples on just some current websites that you can look at that do a really good job of pulling in that data and bringing it to customers and consumers.
Oh no, you're muted, Mike. Classic, right?
Yes, that is classic. And wow. Okay. Yeah, this is my first time on a webinar. No, I'm just kidding. So really when we're talking about, I think Eric made good points about how the attitudes around environmental practices, the social aspect of how some of the generations, some of the younger generations are looking at how they buy, who they buy from. And really, from an organizational standpoint, this is, I think, where governance comes in, right? To have a plan about how you're going to market, what data is most important if there are compliance regulations. Eric mentioned like the EPA and other kind of regulatory bodies. So making sure that you understand what your exposure and your risk is, how you're going to address and move the organization towards compliance, how you're going to report on that, as well as what data aspects really make up part of that initiative. So putting a framework around your goals and objectives and metrics, things that we'll go through a little later in the webinar, really help focus the organization, make sure that everybody's on the right path. But the important thing is the governance is really, when you're staying on top of it, that's really what helps you protect your brand, right? Like you're ensuring that you have all the data that you need, you're sending correct bills, you're having the right kind of labels and icons on your products. You're speaking to them, and if you're in like more of a technical company, of how your organization is, saving electricity and things of that nature. So making sure that you have a plan, that you have achievable goals, objectives, and metrics, and you know what data you have and what data is most important to underpin those initiatives. Really is where governance, I think, comes into play. Making sure that you're good stewards of your organization, and that people who are interested have the information they need to be able to make good buying decisions.
And along that line too, when you talk about data, Mike, traditional data is available on all products, and it's kind of like there's so many different versions of the same product these days that are made everywhere around the world. If I go on Amazon and I search for anything, right, I'm gonna find 72 versions of the same product, right? So what's going to start setting your product apart to a consumer's eye is some of the filters that you're starting to see. I can show you a good example here because I just happened to look up just detergent sheets, and it was interesting to see the types of filters that are starting to show. So I'm going to share my screen here so you can see it. Because it's not what you would think, right? It's not just how many sheets are in the box and all the basic information that we know everybody contains, right? It was really interesting because it actually saved my recent filter. You notice up here in the top left as climate pledge friendly. And all I wanted to find was something that I looked up sustainability, I believe. And so now there's actually a filter here in the left hand now that takes me to more sustainable products, right? And then if I look down, I've got some of the standard filters I've got by brand and everything that you would normally see, right? But then you start looking at some of these features and it's really interesting because it's, is it hypoallergenic, high efficiency, all of these key points that these are the things that when I start looking at things with my wife and we start to making buying decisions, these are the things that are important. This is not something that would be standard on every single product, right? We expect that to get your core data at the base level, you're going to get this information, right? But where you really start to set yourself apart is this. It's all the key additional information that links to those E and S elements, right? That are important and they're becoming more and more important for the generation that has the buying power today to be able to purchase all these products.
Yeah, I love that material type free option there too. So those are like data points that everybody has to have if they're going to be in this category.
Yes, and this is Amazon standards, right? And that's the beauty of it is we know that Amazon's kind of become the gold standard for a lot of consumer selling, right?
Definitely.
And so if it's here, it's probably pretty important for you to add it to your own data set and manage it and govern it. With that, Mike, I'll kind of turn it back over to you.
Excellent. So I think that now we're kind of looking at, as he mentioned, the icons, the filters. How do you manage to make sure that you have all that type of information, it's displayed correctly, someone's responsible for it, and I think that really it starts with kind of creating a practice around your ESG initiative, right? Utilizing not only just tools, but your organizational structure, having a group dedicated, even if it's part-time to that initiative to make sure that things are going well. So
yeah.
Go ahead, Tracy.
Sorry about that. So like what are some practices that you can implement around those ESG initiatives?
So I think that there are some core principles, right, and best practices of data governance. So like around data classification, right? As you're cataloging your data, understanding where everything is, you're setting up classifications. Is this part of our ESG initiative? Is it privacy data? Are we being good stewards of like the privacy of our customers and that sort of thing? Being able to classify that data is, I think, identify and classify is kind of the number one point, right? Because you can't manage what you don't know that you have. And so within that, defining your internal organizational standards. How we're going to treat certain types of data, where it can be used outside the organization, et cetera. Part of that classification, but defining your regulatory compliance. If you're in an industry that you need to adhere and produce auditable compliance type of reporting, making sure that you identify those elements that go into that process is like the key aspect. From there, I really think that defining goals, objectives, and metrics around any initiative, that's, I think, a kind of a data governance best practice, right? Our goal as the organization is to be known as a player kind of in the ESG space, right? To be known that we are taking notice and making steps to really achieve those types of things. Putting objectives. So if we have that goal to become that leader in the space, what little tasks do we need to accomplish so that we can get there? And then once we define that, we have the next layer down, which how do we measure that, right? You can't manage what you don't measure. So being able to define out your strategy through goals and objectives and metrics, and then being able to kind of link those or relate those or tie those to the actual data really not only cements it for the organization, but it allows you to democratize that across the organization. I know at Precisely, we have what we call Precisely values. And so in our, kind of all hands types of meetings, there's generally a presentation about our Precisely values, which are very centered around ESG. And in that way, we get resources and we can do kind of like our own research. Um, Responsibilities is another place I would highly recommend. So while you have all this data, I need to be able to ask questions and somebody needs to be responsible. So good stewards, maybe like goal owners, people that are responsible within the organization for achieving these initiatives. And then last thing I'll talk about right here is traceability, auditable processes. This brings in things like lineage, where the data was, how it was transformed, how it ends up on a report, where that report is allowed to go. So the traceability through the entire initiative is another thing that I would recommend.
And Mike, you kind of bring up a good point too about categorization of that data. Uh, in the EU, they're miles ahead from an environmental standpoint. They have a full taxonomy that's in play. There are standards that are ready to go, that you should adhere to, right? It's similar to how we have PIEs for product data for automotive in the US, or we have GDSN that we use for most product types. It's very well defined. And so it makes it a little bit easier if you're trying to make that jump into a global market. You could probably use that as your blueprint and move that out to all regions. And then as each region gets its own ESG standards for the environmental piece, you can start applying those through. And you can have that ability if you manage your data in a sense that you can set it up that way, right? You categorize it and then say, okay, it's this. And then for this location or this region, these are the additional data points that are needed. And for this region, these are some additional data points that are needed. And for this region, we only need, your bronze level data, for example. So it kind of ties to how a lot of us have set up our data lakes, bronze, silver, and gold. That information could be in there as well and be managed through your ESG process there.
I agree. I think that one good aspect, and speaking kind of from a data governance background, lineage is always important, right? Where that data came from, how it's being transformed, what its quality is, right? Quality being an aspect of governance, we want to make sure that we see, as we're in charge of these types of initiatives, we want to see where data might need more care, right, throughout its life cycle. So that way we can adjust processes to account for that and make sure, because again, it's not as standardized in the US, but in the EU, there are very real compliance that they have to adhere to. And I'm hoping some of that's coming over our way around like privacy laws and that sort of thing in the US as well. So understanding who owns it, where is it, where'd it come from, those kind of things around the data are really, I think, important, because when you think of ESG, it's kind of a concept, right? But it has real world and real data points associated with it. And I think that that's one thing that I'd like to get across in the webinar is that, while this is kind of a conceptual thing, real data is involved and the proper manage of that.
Correct.
I think you call out one other key point on this too, which is the data coming from multiple sources, right? And that's one of the challenges. One of the great things about the way that millennials shop and the way that we see things today is that you are grabbing all this information from product reviews and all these things from all over the place. Are all of those pieces of information, especially when it relates to ESG concepts, are all of them necessarily accurate? Are they 100% there? If I write a review and I say that this is terrible and it, blah, 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 it made my face break out, you know, but it's not something we get something directly from the vendor that says, no, it is hypoallergenic. And then we get something else from another source that says, well, it's actually certified by this group, whatever that group might be. Now you have the lineage that you have to determine and which one holds more weight. Now, me as a consumer, maybe initially I'm maybe just looking at the reviews and going, oh, okay. But then what I start to do if I'm smart is I go, there's a lot of fives and there's a lot of ones. So let me go look at the data here. Let me look at the actual product itself and make my decision. So that's the stuff that we kind of have to weed through with the governance process, right? And provide the most accurate um, version of the truth, I guess is what we would say for that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, how do we ensure that the data that's being reported is accurate and within like compliances? I know that we were talking about, the EU, they have their data points, but if you're doing global business, you should be adhering to those data points if you're doing work with Europe. So, I mean, people in companies in North America that are global companies need to be aware of what's going on in the other countries. So, how do we ensure that kind of level of data quality?
I think that's a great question. Um, and I think that there are multiple different ways. First off, standardization of data, right? So a lot of organizations, they have the same data in multiple different places. If you take names, for example, my name being Mike, I might be Mike in one system, I might be Michael in another. I might have my address might be 1234 East Street. Apartment 15 in one place, and it might be 1342 East Street with no apartment number. So the idea is to be able to standardize that data so that you're working with kind of a singular set. And Eric knows a lot more about that than I do, so I'll let him talk to kind of the single source of truth. But then reconciling that data. As we mentioned, most organizations have a very complex technical ecosystem. Data moves not only from application to application, but within applications as well, where transformations are happening. We've moved from kind of an ETL landscape where we're extracting, transforming in a tool and loading to more of a ELT, right? Where we're getting this data, we're moving it into newer technologies, and we're doing the transformations there. Either way, reconciliation becomes really important to be able to ensure that the data that I started off with was aggregated or transformed in the appropriate way, and we have what the expected outcome is. If that's a one-to-one or an aggregation where one-to-many, that type of thing, being able to reconcile that data through its life cycle is very important to making sure that it stays fit for purpose. And then everybody does data quality at some point, right? If it's SQL queries or things like that, if you don't have a tool or if you have a tool, um, managing that can be a big unwieldy beast, right? Just the thought of applying data quality across your organization can be intimidating, but it means nothing without being able to have the metrics over the top of it. Data quality scoring, having remediation processes, in fact, to if you do see things wrong, you have a process that helps you fix that and standardize it and keep that from happening again. So those three things like standardization, reconciliation, and reporting, those are key aspects. Profiling is also always a good idea to understand the size and shape of the data. So I think that a couple of like real world examples around that is ensuring, especially like when we get into all this iconography and different products, and we're using a lot of retail kind of examples because it's easy to imagine a physical thing of milk or cheese, that sort of thing. But like a real world is around like allergens, right? Peanut allergens, dairy. My mother is dairy allergic, right? So we have to, when we go to restaurants and things like that, we have to make sure that we're doing our research ahead of time, that we can get meals that aren't going to make her sick. And I think in the same way as like peanut allergies. What'd you say, Eric?
Nope.
Yeah. So um, I think that ensuring that you have good data going in. You understand, like I've worked with product companies. If we just talk about like getting coffee, right? Understanding where that coffee came from, right? Was it humanely harvested? How did it get to where I'm at today? Did it come in contact with things like peanut products, things like that, where I really need to be able to understand? And as Eric mentioned before, um, I come from like Gen X, right? We didn't have the internet. But a large, vast majority of our society now has grown up with the internet and all the information they could ever need just at their fingertips. And they use that a lot to track down not only like your product, but like who you're getting your products from and those types of things. So I think that understanding where the data comes from, what those companies are doing, and how we're packaging and putting it out there is all a part of ensuring the quality around your ESG process.
And if you want to see an example of that, let me just kind of share here. So this is an example of environmental data that influences, particularly my wife. We just had another baby a few months ago, 6 months
Yay.
ago. Yeah, and it's funny because with our first, it was just we were just going to do this. We're going to do whatever, right? We didn't really think about it. And as we're on number four, and at this point, we've got a lot more years of experience, more buying power, all the things that we do. So every decision we make the decision based upon more principles and feel goods, right? It's a very different approach than the traditional just I want it, I'm going to get it, and I'm going to get it because I like this brand, which is the old school, right? That's the baby boomer generation or Generation X where like I want it. There's probably a few options. I'm going to pick probably the cheapest one or the best one that I think based on what I've got, the limited amount of information that I have. And now it's like, I'm going to do this because I feel good about the company or I feel good about their, it could be their political stance. It could be their environmental stance. It could be a lot of things. And it's all backed up with data. And that's the key. And then you can present this data. So what if you search most companies these days, they have some sort of a site over here. Like this is an example of their climate journey is what Gerber is calling it. And as we go through, it talks about the fact that not only is the product itself organic, right? But they're calling out that they're carbon neutral with their packaging, right? Which is now a big deal. So like for my wife, this was really important. She said, hey, I want to make sure that whatever company we go with, if they have a good carbon footprint. If they don't, I don't want to purchase from that company because she grew up with seeing all the things on TV and everything else, right? Like XRLP spills, things like that. There were events in her life that made her say, hey, we got to do the right thing. We got to do the right thing for the environment because I want my kids to have a good environment. I want their kids to have a good environment. And so it's a change in belief, right? But all of this is data, right? And this data can be tied to any product within their product infrastructure, right? So we could say, hey, all of our packaging is carbon neutral, right? That can now be applied to every single product within their product line if they want to do that. So those kinds of things become very, very, very useful, right? Because now this is a sales tool. It's using environmental data. So it's using the E in our ESG and it's applying it to, in this case, globally, but you could apply this to each individual product that fits those requirements. And then it tells a story, right? And it tells a good marketing story. And it also influences that buying decision for the group that has the money to spend at this point.
Very, very true. So all of this sounds great. What would I need to start making sure that we're on the right track for tracking all this ESG data and our governance and our quality? How do we get
I'll
started?
jump in. Yeah, I'll jump in and take that. Um,
Thanks.
I think that a data integrity platform is the most holistic type of solution, to be able to not only initiate but manage an ESG initiative within an organization. Sorry. And when I mean like an integrity suite, products that are out there that offer you data quality, observability, enrichment, and most importantly, like a shared catalog, right? So we talked earlier about like, you can't really manage all this data until you really know what data you have. So step one is kind of cataloging all that data and then starting to make decisions about classifications. Um, Hopefully you have a solution that provides you a decision tree or AI generated recommendations, right, around data quality and observability and how we should classify data. So a kind of all-in-one suite will help you identify your critical data elements that are essential to your ESG program. And those critical data elements, the reason I say that is because not all data is created equal, right? We classify things into a critical data element as it's being used in decision making and profitability studies, things like that. Those are and creating your ESG critical data elements really puts a spotlight on those types of things. So identifying it, classifying it, and then starting to clean it, right? We talked about names being kind of different, and the idea is that we want to get to a master data management type of solution at the end. We want to make sure that the process is following through standardization and cleansing and validation, making sure that we're staying proactive on those critical data elements using things like observability, right? Where we profile the data on a regular basis and we set up rules around thresholds or percent changes in that data to understand where things might be going off the rail. Combining that in with like data quality scoring and governance scoring around your governed assets, that all of that kind of feeds into. Addresses are always important. And the information, the enrichment that you can then apply once you start like standardizing your addresses and making sure that they're deliverable and that sort of thing, you can then start enriching those data sets with risk factors and thousands of different attributes that really add value to the ESG organization, understanding where my carbon footprint might be higher due to the atmospheric, like I might have to run a heater or an air conditioner more often, things like that, where you're enriching. So applying kind of a fully integrated solution that moves across different functionalities, I think really leads us into where we all want to be, which is kind of like around master data management. Does that make sense, Eric?
That does. That does.
Got any tie-ins there for us, Eric, as far as like your favorite platform?
I think one of the things to keep in mind is once you've got that data in that within typically data fabric, right, is really what we're talking about.
Yep.
You've got multiple sources of data, all that information is coming together into your data fabric. Then you need to figure out which one is sort of going to be your source of truth, and you need to store that somewhere, right, and provide that information. And then you can enrich it with additional information. So this is where an MDM tool like NWorks comes into play, because what you can do is you can have all of that data be matched and merged and everything within that data fabric. Find what the universal source of truth will be, or the best version of the truth will be, and then feed that into your MDM tool. And then MDM or NWorks can then feed any other system downstream. So that allows you to, if you want to talk about transactional, you can set up those items in your ERP systems, right? You can have that be the starting point for that. And then you have that good gold standard data that's going to be required for the transactional system to be able to do it. You can then add enriched data on top of that may be company specific, right? Your additional marketing information and the details that you have, and provide that downstream to, say, a service like Amazon or Walmart or whoever you're syndicating to, and you have that ability. So basically, if you set the data up correctly and you use those principles for the ESG data, you can incorporate that into your master data. And then that becomes a part of your master data, which then in turn allows you to send that downstream to the different systems to syndicate and use that to increase sales, right? So that's really what we're looking at in the long term, is figuring out how we're going to get into that little short list for the consumer, right? Because they've got so many options now. We know about it. I mean, you've got thousands and thousands and thousands of options for everything, and there are going to be small things that are going to make that decision for you. And that's the key, is if we get that one version of the truth, we know it is the most valid version of the truth that we can possibly put together, be it at any level, whether it's product data, customer data, anything, location data, all of those things can live there, and then we can syndicate that down to the systems that need to acquire that data to pass on.
Okay. So do either of you have a real world example of all this in action?
I do. Yeah,
Okay, awesome.
I'll jump in.
Okay.
Let me share my screen. I actually have a quick presentation that I'd like to present on this. Everybody can see that? Yeah, I'll get a
Mm-hmm.
nod from. Okay, great.
Yep.
So basically, uh, we had an organization. Their objectives were to understand the systems, data, and processes that support their ESG KPIs. They want to capture and catalog critical assets, establish that end-to-end picture, right? That lineage that we spoke about a little bit earlier, and really provide a sense of trust to their organization, their stakeholders, right? So many times we hear that I just don't trust the data, or is that number real, that sort of thing. So again, they have objectives to change the culture of kind of questioning data to one of trust, right? So which enables self-service and that sort of thing. So the challenges around that were it's hard to kind of identify some of the ESG uh, reporting elements, right? And so putting a process in place to kind of understand that. Again, low trust in the data, manual and time-consuming processes for reporting, and then really just a lack of agility to be able to handle data impacts, if they're hacks, or if they're other kind of nefarious things that are going on. So this organization reached out to Precisely, and we entered into a kind of a partnership around our data governance module from our data integrity suite. Um, this allows them to harvest their metadata, so catalog everything, identify and classify what data is most important. So that's the increased kind of the benefit gets to once we democratize this, right? We've cataloged, we've classified, we've identified responsibilities. Then we're able to centrally locate all of this information and roll it out to the organizational stakeholders, right? So they can understand the data better. They get an increased trust in the data because they're seeing data quality scoring. They're seeing how we're managing the quality of those aspects through the governance solution. And we're reducing that manual effort, right? Like, how many of you have had somebody ask you for a report or to give them information, right? That you've then had to spend time, and that time can be days, weeks, hours, minutes, but you've had to spend time researching, finding that information, packaging it, and putting it out. So reducing that manual effort is also a benefit of the governance solution. And then obviously the deeper visibility into upstream and downstream impacts when changes are made, and just really have a good set of fact-based readiness issues and assets ready for your internal stakeholders. So that is kind of how one of our partner organizations has utilized our data integrity suite, a service of the suite, which is governance, to help their initiative. They started at a top down, where they were cataloging their data assets, but more importantly, they were defining their process, responsibilities, their goals, and their objectives through that process. And it really helped everybody get on the same page. So how do we kind of get there, right? Historically, ESG is, we're trying to minimize risk, right? We don't want to turn off a segment of our buying audience because they feel like we're not treating the environment or society correctly. So minimizing the risk through ESG. Then being able to identify those assets. So again, we're coming in, we're cataloging those assets. We're creating business terms, right? Like you don't have a column in a table that has like carbon footprint or greenhouse gases or things like that, right? So what we want to do is we want to create a common understanding of those through what we call business terms, and then link the supporting data from the catalog to that, so that the users have a business-friendly way to find the information they're looking for while still gaining trust and understanding the actual physical data that sits behind that. which kind of really lets them democratize this information, right? As if we're all pointing in the same direction, we're all moving in the same direction. And so that starts with being open and sharing the data that the organization is putting together around these initiatives, setting up your KPIs, your again your goals, objectives, and metrics. I sound like a broken clock, but that's one of our kind of core principles. And then more importantly, those relationships, right? So being able to see and visualize how data impacts or is related to other pieces of data, policies, ownership, data quality rules, what those outputs are. Today's society is less about read and more about see, right? So with all the great technology out there, there's a lot of good visuals that people get used to seeing and taking in information that way. And so being able to accurately visualize your objectives, your initiatives, your data in a very simple and automated way is a great benefit. And then lastly, really just like ensuring that we have good trust, right? So building up governance scores, how are we curating or managing this data? And I think really data quality scoring is super important, right? These elements, if we're at like a business concept or at a physical piece of data, we want to understand if it's fit for use. Is it of good quality? And doing that quickly, right? As we're browsing different assets in our catalog and things like that, we want to be able to quickly identify that's not maybe data I want to use, or maybe that is, if that makes sense. I think that was the end of my show. And so I will stop sharing there.
Well done. Well done, though.
Thank you.
All right. So, Eric, can you give us a tie-in for Interworks?
Yeah. So
Cool.
another good example would be you've got that data that comes in, right? And you might have some of those keywords or phrases, or maybe it's certification, the data on the certification. The vendor or wherever you receive that data from may not necessarily have the actual logo or the link to the documentation for that available in in the data that they provided. What you could do within Interworks is have the ability that when that data component comes through, when it's fed through for an MDM item into the Interworks system, you could have a trigger that says, okay, it is green certified, right? And if it's green certified, there's a logo that we store within Interworks that can be supported to that green certified element, whatever it might be. And then that could be tied to any product that has that value of green certified. And then you could ship that on to a syndication point. So it could be print, it could be Amazon, it could be anywhere that we want to send it. Right. So it gives you the ability to add additional data on that has been verified because that information has come from your governance piece. And we said, yes, it is biocertified, or it is this, it is that, it is greenhouse gas certified. And oh, by the way, here we have a logo that goes with that, or maybe we have our own internal logo that we use that supports that, on our websites and things like that. So a lot of the additional enrichment can happen inside of the MDM tool, and you also have the ability to do additional business rules as well. So if you needed additional governance of that data, like for example, maybe we took in what we would consider maybe like a silver level for our data, right? Was acceptable to go to MDM because that's the minimum that was required for most of our downstream systems. But you wanted for a particular system to have that gold standard, and maybe that's additional enrichment or additional rules or business requirements. You can set those up within MDM. You're still keeping the quality of your data clean coming into the system, right? You haven't had to change anything in that, but you can add additional enrichment before you send that downstream to other systems.
Perfect. Okay. So we are getting close to 15 minutes left of our time. So we're going to start the Q&A session. So question number one. This is a lot of information. Where should I start? How do I get this going? That's one of our questions. Can one of you take that?
Sure. So I think that utilizing experts, right, to help you get a strategy together is really highly recommended, right? Our partners at Go Amplify, they have years of experience around, especially master data management processes and solutions. Precisely has a strategic services arm that is product agnostic. Their only job is to help organizations meet their data management needs, whether that's governance or quality or different initiatives like ESG. But I would highly recommend that, I'm just giving a couple examples. Obviously, we're going to tout our own stuff, but I would highly recommend that, that you get somebody who is versed in these types of processes.
Yeah, and in terms of Amplify, I mean, we have the ability to do the technical if you want to do the implementation, if you wanted to move that direction. We also have a strong strategy arm that can handle sort of the pre-work that needs to happen that we talked about establishing those rules and that design within your data model that's going to support the information that you need to be able to send maybe down to your MDM's tool or out to the various syndication points or whatever service that you're using at that point.
Perfect.
Mike, it looks like we have a question too that came up in the chat. You want to throw that in at you?
Yeah, I see that. So it's asking how flexible the product is in connecting to various internal and external platforms. That is a great question. I don't think that there is a company out there that will support like an end-to-end lineage for every technology in an organization of size would have in-house, right? I know it precisely. We support a vast variety of different technologies, databases, cloud storage, cloud applications, all of your CRMs and things like that, to be able to harvest that metadata in an automated fashion. And we add more connections every day. So I think that I can only speak for our tool. We are very flexible in what types and what technologies that we can start building your catalog in an automated fashion with. I hope that answers the question.
That's great. Okay, and here's another one. All right, now that we know how to document this, how do we start putting this out in the real world?
Right. So I think that there are a couple of different mechanisms, right? First off, I think Eric just showed you a couple of earlier in our presentation, right? Showed you a couple of quick things. He went out to Amazon, right, and started looking at kind of how they're filtering. Went to a product provider to show you how they're advertising their ESG initiatives, how they're working towards meeting each of the pillars. So I would think that marketing, being strategic about anything that leaves your organization's four walls, whether they're virtual or physical, about conceptual, how it's going to be received. Are there angles at which it could be poked at? So I think really putting a process in, documenting all of that information, making it public to the organization is a great place to start. But you really need a strategy, and then you need to document that process, and then that turns into repeatable processes for other actions as well.
That's great. Do we have any additional questions before we start closing? Going once, going twice. Sold. All right. So that is all we have time for today. Thank you so much for joining us. And we hope that you're coming away from this session with a lot of great new information that you can make actionable in your businesses. Amplify and Precisely are geared up and ready to help you with all your data initiatives, whether they're ESG focused or not. Keep an eye out for your recording, as well as additional ESG information coming directly to your inboxes over the coming weeks. Thanks again, and bye.
Thank you.